So now what we want to talk about is the distinction that the chapter makes between private interest groups and public interest groups. And at the outset, it's important to recognize that that division of the world is not a complete one, that there are ways in which there are gray areas and complicated questions. And much of social science is actually talking about categorization and thinking about whether the categories we come up with are worthwhile. Some of the weaknesses, it's a useful tool to understand things. And we saw this already when we talked about federalism and the idea that the framers of the US Constitution came up with as they argued that the world can be divided into two spheres. There are great and aggregate interests and local and particular ones. And the great and aggregate interests were going to be the ones that the national government would necessarily do. And then the local and particularized ones would be the ones that the states would have. But as we know, as you saw in the examples, that it's sometimes hard to tell what is great and aggregate and what is local and particular. For example, the environment is one that you could make a strong case, and many of you did and think about this in terms of the question about the environment, is you can make a case that this is a national emergency. It is perhaps even an international one, in which case it's a national, a great and aggregate one, and the federal government should take a lead on that. The impacts of environmental changes are going to vary from state to state and locality to locality. And so in that sense, there are certainly local and particular impacts of that important policy area, in which case the state government should get involved. Similarly, this distinction between private is not going to be perfect, but it is at least worthwhile to think about that, even though there are some exceptions, to think about the ways in which that division might make sense. And they're linked to this idea we talked about in part one of this lecture, is the idea of the public goods and the free rider problem. And that is that public interest groups, those that are done by environmental groups, consumer groups, dealing with big issues, are ones, consumer protection, all of those things are public interest groups. And they're ones that often deal with non-material interests. They are talking about ideas that are not necessarily translated easily into money terms. It is talking about it's hard to know exactly what the monetary benefit is for environmental protection of the Arctic wilderness. I'm not going to go up to Alaska and visit it. I may just feel that the world is a better place because we don't do drilling in the Arctic wilderness. So in that sense, to be able to put a price tag on how important this is. Public interest groups are ones that deal with public goods to a large extent, the provision of what they're going to do, environmental protection, consumer protection. All of these things are going to help everyone, not only those who are part of the interest groups that are lobbying government to do those things, that once the law is passed, it's passed and it applies to all of us. And so in that sense, it's hard for the interest groups to fight for things that will only protect their members. And because of that, then people will free ride. If they still benefit from it and not join the interest group, then they're even better off, is what they argue in a more selfish way. So what this means is public interest groups have a greater need for coming up with these selective incentives, spending money to be able to encourage people to participate in the interest group. And so in all of these, the public interest groups have a difficult time getting the numbers of individuals to join, to give money to the cause, and then that money can be used to influence Congress, to try to influence the executive branch, to try to have court cases if necessary, if going to different states, if there are in fact different laws in different states, or even trying to get the awareness about these issues. All of those things cost money, and public interest groups don't have the level of money that they should, even based on the level of support for their ideas that they have. They have to spend the money to get selective incentives, to encourage people to make that donation, to give the money to the group that they believe in. And that takes away from money that they could be spending on fighting the cause directly. On the other hand, there are private interest groups. Private interest groups are those like corporations, unions, professional organizations, where it is pretty clear cut in a very material way. If successful, then if a union is successful, then the amount of the pay raise that individuals will get, or the amount of vacation time that they have, or whatever medical benefits they have, that will be identifiable and important and recognized by the people themselves. They're private interests that influence us in a direct private way, and they're often material interests. They're interests that can have a dollar amount. You can certainly see this with corporations. Corporations are very good at figuring out if a particular tax bill is passed or not passed, what is the impact going to be for their bottom line? And those things they can calculate and then can figure out, is it worth they're a lobbyist to go and influence Congress to be able to offset and to stop certain tax increases that would be a stream of payments that corporations would have to pay year after year. And so that's why it's big money that they'll spend to be able to influence the legislation. It's not just taxing, but it's also regulations placed on different industries. It's also the ways in which the executive branch actually implements the laws that are put into place. It is also that there can be court cases to challenge us to slow down implementation of a particular bill. All of these things are important and expensive. And private interest groups, because the interests of the individuals are private, it makes it easier for those know that you need to join the group to be successful. Furthermore, if you think about this in the case of something like oil exploration, and to maintain the subsidies that oil companies get to do oil exploration, they don't need it because they make the most amount of profits of any corporation in human history over the past decade or so. But there is still in the tax law protections for and subsidies for oil companies to go and explore other sources of oil and natural gas. The argument is that that is important to the security of the United States. This energy independence is one that some people argue was critically important, and so it is worth making sure that the price of oil and natural gas stays relatively low so that we can spend less for those important inputs to a whole bunch of production in the United States. And so those subsidies exist. And there are times when you take a look at that, and especially if the government has a deficit, that says, well, maybe we should change the tax code a little bit to make them pay a little bit more. And they certainly benefit from striking it rich and finding a source of oil and natural gas. So maybe more of the risk should be borne by the corporation. But the other thing is that an interest group that's there to fight to make sure the subsidies stay there for these corporations can often write the law or have the law written in a specific way to punish those individuals, those corporations that might try to be free riders. So for example, let's argue that Shell Oil does mostly exploration in, say the Gulf of Mexico, as opposed to other oil companies that are doing it in the interior of the United States, in North Dakota and places like that, or are doing it on the eastern seaboard or the western seaboard. And so if, in fact, you have that Shell is particularly involved in exploration in the Gulf, and let's say Shell, for whatever reason, decides they don't want to join the interest group that is there to lobby Congress to go after the EPA and the Energy Department to make sure that subsidies for oil exploration are not touched. And Shell decides they want to save some money this year, that they're not going to contribute and not join the interest group, not give the money to the lobbyists to be able to lobby on behalf of the oil interests. And so then the lobbyist, when they do go in, can say, well, write the law in such a way so that we're going to talk about oil exploration that is done on the eastern seaboard, on the western seaboard, in Alaska, in Colorado, North Dakota, and things like that. Those will maintain their subsidies. But those that are done in the Gulf of Mexico, not so much. And so there are ways, there are tools that the interest groups can use to make sure that the members actually pay up and are card-carrying members and pay the organization to pay for the lobbyists to do their work. There's less need for selective incentives. You don't think of, oh, you'll get this great t-shirt, ExxonMobil, if you join and pay for this lobbyist that these oil interests are doing. You don't need to do things like that. That's something that public interest groups have to do. The American Medical Association, unions, corporations, things like that don't have to do these selective incentives to encourage people to join a group. It's obvious what the benefits of joining that group are. And so what you have is that because the interest groups don't have to spend, or the other way of saying it, the better way of saying it, the extra resources that public interest groups have to spend to get people to join their group in the first place makes it so that private interest groups have more of an advantage in our system. They have more resources available. Furthermore, if you think about it, a lot of these private interest groups are made up of individuals who already have more resources. We're talking about corporations, we're talking about CEOs, we're talking about doctors, we're talking about lawyers, we're talking about individuals who already have a lot of resources to begin with. And so that means that they are already privileged in our society in terms of, as many of you talked about in your first paper, that in fact there are ways in which people who have higher levels of income higher levels of education, different types of jobs, are more easily able to go get the information that's necessary to feel confident in their vote, to know they have to register and vote, and to find time in their busy day to go vote. All of those things are easier for those individuals. And those same individuals are joining interest groups that tend to be more powerful because they don't have to spend money to get people to join the interest group. And so in that sense, one of the key concerns that the textbook is pointing out that we want to think about, and we're going to be doing in the next part of this, is to say that not all groups have equal access to the tools of pluralism. The separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism creates opportunities for interest groups to be able to influence politics. But not everyone can afford it equally. Not every interest group can afford it equally, nor do individuals, in terms of economics, in terms of their professional status and things like that, have equal access to interest groups that fight on their behalf. And so what we have is this economic and social inequality then becomes translated into political inequality, which obviously is a threat to the idea of democracy. Yes, interest groups are an expression of political liberty, but as we know, it takes political liberty, popular sovereignty, and political equality. And so if this aspect of political liberty is hurting political equality too much, then maybe there should be some restrictions placed on what interest groups do and how they do it. And so in the next slide, we're going to talk about the sort of activities that interest groups typically do.